I went back to the guy then, and I'm like, hey, man, do you have any more of that redwood, that really long stuff from the Bridge of the Gods when they raised that? And he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I'm like, no, it's really tight grain redwood. It's 2 1/4 by 10 inches. It's like 20 foot. They're up in the top, way up high. He's like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I'm like, man, you gave me a piece of this wood to make a bass out of. He's like, oh, did you make a bass? I'm like, yeah. He's like, show me some pictures. And I showed him some pictures on my phone. He's like, just all right, come on out to the pile.
Welcome to another episode of Contrabass Conversations, your show covering life on the low end of the spectrum. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and I'm so pleased to bring you today's conversation with Seth Kimmel. Seth is a luthier based in Eugene, Oregon, and I had the pleasure of hanging out with him and getting to know him at the International Society of Bassists Convention this past June. One thing that was super fascinating to me was playing 3 of Seth's basses that he had there at the convention. The basses were pretty much identical except for the different woods that Seth used for them, and the differences in tone were remarkable. So that's what we dig into today. What effect different woods have on the sound of basses? What commonalities do different types of woods have? It's a super fascinating conversation. And Seth's a great guy. If you're not familiar with his work, he's won many awards at the ISB convention, the Violin Society of America. His basses are played all over the place. And he really likes using wood from the Pacific Northwest, where he lives, where he's from. So we talk about all this and much more. I know you're going to love this. It's a great deep dive into wood and bass construction. We've got 2 great sponsors for today's episode, Upton Bass and the Bass Violin Shop, and you'll hear more about them later. But let's dive into this conversation with Seth Kimmel.
Obviously a lot of the basses you make are, spruce and maple, but you're using other woods too. And I'd love to talk about that a bit.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And it is pretty interesting. It's a little bit of a hard conversation, so I might just sort of approach it from a slightly different angle and get there, if that makes sense to you. Because, I think if you were to what's the difference between these woods, these tone woods, and what you'd want to say is what's the best one would be a great answer. We'll get this, you're going to be golden, you can play anything on that, But I think we all know that it's just not that simple. And so when I approach bass, or if anybody is approaching thinking about getting a bass or thinking about what they want, I try and think about 4 different things, and wood is actually the last one. So I'll list them off. You got a player who's, an individual, and I think that right away there's some specific needs and wants that this player has. Maybe they play classical, maybe they play jazz, maybe they play all solo stuff, so you have to think about what they're going to want, because that isn't always going to be the same machine or whatever, and then some people are just different sizes than other people or have different preferences. They have an aesthetic that they really like this shape of bass. And so, if you really like gambas and you really don't like violin corner basses, it doesn't make a lot of sense to think about violin corner basses. And so it's sort of the same way if you just don't like the way a walnut bass looks, you wouldn't want to think about that. So there's this individual nature right away, especially if you're thinking about designing a bass, So I just start, you got this player person, and we're going to refer back to her the whole time, I think, because the next thing you think about is that sort of, I call it the geometry of the bass or the physics of the bass. Modern basses are a little different than older basses. A lot of them have shorter strings, maybe slightly higher overstands and bridges, and we can get into that kind of thing. But, what does a player want here? Some players need a shorter string. Some players need a longer string. I have a fairly standard basic geometry to my instruments, but it's definitely, again, something to consider. If, people approach me and they want a 38-inch string, then right away you have a whole different geometry on the instrument. Your neck's a different length, your body, where the bridge is ends up, either you change the design or you put it somewhere different or that kind of thing, if that makes sense. So you got this person and then the sort of basic geometry of the bass. What's this bass design? And sort of, I guess then you do sort of break that down, but the shape of this box, how big this, the box, I mean the bass itself, the body that you build to put the neck on and attach strings to, it really does affect tone. I mean, we could be having the same conversation about wood as we're having about boxes, because I make a bunch of different box shapes too. I make a very small bass, and I make a bass that is a little bigger, and I make a guitar-shaped one, and I make these gamba ones, and the bassetto corners, and the violin corners, and the little, so And they actually, as I've made enough of them, and really, it's you just can't repeat enough. I've made a lot of basses, but I learn with every one. But they have their own voice. Every box sort of speaks in its own way. And by making, using the same box and making the ribs deeper, you can kind of change its voice a bit. But they kind of have a certain timbre. Like a very large gamba. Just no matter what you make it out of, sort of has a lot of room sound, and I'm going to get to this sort of disgusting tone in just a second with you. I'm going to bring you in. And then the very last thing is wood. And you're like, well, what is the different tonal qualities of wood? And that's where and then we're, it's a tricky thing to talk about, because here's where I was leading with this. And then I think we'll see, maybe right away he, learn something, but also discover how hard it is to talk about. If we were to discuss, and I was to say, Jason, instead of, you asking me about wood, let me ask you a super quick question about strings first. I think we're all pretty familiar with two kinds of strings. I mean, most everybody's heard or played spiracores, those somatic ones, and then bel cantos are a very popular orchestral string. So right away, and they're different, arguably quite different strings. How would you describe their tonal differences? And maybe we could use your vocabulary then to talk about the wood.
Sure.
If that makes sense.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, if I think of spiracore, I think bright. I think projecting. I think sustain. I think no. It's funny because I was just interviewing a lyrist hung from Diderot. We were talking about like what goes into strings and like lack of dampening agents, right? Like just like this big ringing, projecting. Play a pizzicato and you can go get a cup of coffee and you come back and it's still ringing. And then bel canto, I think of like sort of creamy, rich, dark, kind of chocolatey orchestral sound, kind of buttery, more veiled or covered sound, I guess, but like with, I guess, warmth would be if I was going to just use one word, probably like warmth for bel cantos and projection or ringing or something for spiracores. That's kind of my take on it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I wrote down a few of these things as we were going along there, and then I just put some arrows by projecting and warmth.
Yeah.
And what I really like how you did that, because a challenge I have is to be really just being really subjective or objective about it. I mean, like we like just because they're different, it doesn't mean one is better than the other.
Right.
You're talking about. Although you're, on spiracores, we mentioned lack of dampening or projecting and bright, and right away you were like the creamy, rich, dark orchestral. I think you had chocolatey in there, yeah. But then like the challenge word, right? And right away you got it's a little, you said veiled,
yeah.
Which, and that's like the hardest thing when you have a bass. It's like, it's so dark, but a lot of times when people say dark, it seems like they're saying quiet.
Yeah.
But it's a very interesting thing that some notes feel very loud and as if they're bright, or sometimes say they have a lot of overtones, and some notes feel very loud, but there's just this one fundamental kind of note that doesn't have that sort of bright sound around it. So I think it's pretty useful.
Next up, we cover the woods that Seth's using. Super fascinating. I know you're going to love this. And I'd like to give a shout out before we get into that to Upton Bass. And I want to talk a bit to you today about their Bostonian model. So the history behind this model, it was conceived at the 2009 ISB convention. Great convention, Penn State. I was there, super fun. So the Upton folks first met Lynn Seaton there, and they started talking about what Lynn liked, and this Bostonian model is a result of that conversation. So Lynn liked different things about the various Upton basses they had at the time. He liked the car outline, but he liked deeper ribs, and then the fully carved poplar back with a taller top and back arching than a car bass would have, and combining that with the dimensions from Lynn's old bass. So the result is this Bostonian bass. It's kind of an American model, quote unquote American model. And that's an inside joke, by the way, in the violin world. Beautiful model, and we've got a link in the show notes for you to check that out, and you can just go to uptonbass.com. And I'd like to give a shout out to the Bass Violin Shop down there in North Carolina, doing great work for so many people, including Rick Jones of Acoustic Image. Here's what Rick has to say about the Bass Violin Shop. He says, the bass sounds so great, his bass, that I went back, these are Rick's words, that I went back to an earlier string set that I like. Olive G, Perazzi D, Spiracor Vike A, and Spiracor Orchestra E. He said, I stopped using the Olive and Perazzi because they wouldn't speak before you did your magic. Now they sound great. I played a gig last night, and it was a real pleasure. The gut synthetic strings have a stronger fundamental that makes the note pop, resulting in a more defined quarter note feel. But wouldn't we all love that for our bass? And those are high words of praise coming from somebody like Rick Jones with his fabulous amplifiers that he makes. So whether you're looking to buy a bass, get a setup done, or repair or restoration, get a bow, get some accessories, or even rent a bass if you're in that neck of the woods, check out bassviolinshop.com. Okay, we're digging into the woods that Seth uses for his basses.
I use primarily Pacific Northwest woods, so for neck and back and sides, maple is the traditional wood, but I'm using Western maple, a big leaf maple, which is just a little lower density, a little not as hard, especially it's Eastern maple, but also not as hard as the traditional European maple. And but it's very similar to that, and there's a lot of variety in European maple. I've gotten European maple that would seem almost identical to this Western or big leaf maple or something like that. I'm pretty comfortable with that wood. I really like it. It makes a beautiful sounding bass, and it's sort of and then of course we do this backside thing. I'm just going to talk about the backs a little bit, and then or back front thing. And I have mixed woods on the sides, and then it just gets so confusing. There's really no way to even. But if we were to just sort of say this maple's got a real traditional kind of sound, and I think it isn't like a bel canto, but it is sort of more in that sort of creamy, rich area, and it sounds a lot like what you'd expected a good European bass to sound like. Western woods seem to lend themselves to bass, I think, because they're a little lower density. So it's a nice open sound, good focus, real nice fundamental, and is warm also. And I use that backside, the neck. It's real stable. I often will use a maple neck in conjunction with another tone wood I use all the time is walnut. It's black walnut. It's the local tree around here, as is the maple. And it often has just the most incredible figure. People also call it claro walnut, and that's mostly because it's been selected for such a really nice figure. But I just call it black walnut, and it has sort of in general, a little more of this sort of bright sound. It has more sustain. It's very interesting, if you're doing your note just sort of can grow. As you add a little vibrato, it almost seems as if it's getting louder. And it also, again, sort of a little lack of dampening. Sometimes I'll, say it's as if your note's being served to you in a teacup. It's got sort of lots of overtones around it and stuff like that. It sounds really good at the back of the hall. One of the oddest things about it, and I'm modifying my back designs and stuff as I go. And, so this is less of a problem than it was at the beginning, but it's kind of a stiff wood as compared to maple. It's just a little bit stiffer. And it makes it work really well and project really well. But oddly enough, sometimes the hardest place to hear it is right where you're standing, because it's all this wood, all this sound is getting reflected 10 feet away from you. And so that's sort of an odd quality about it. Most of the time it's not a problem, but there are times when people will be trying instruments and stand behind it and say, "Oh, that's okay," and then they'll swap places with their friend. And, oh my gosh, it's so loud in front. And the friend was like, "I thought it was a little louder than this," so an interesting, interesting challenge, And you'll find that actually with thick back instruments in general too. You'll kind of find that they're pushing sound away from the player, which is a good thing usually. I've also used myrtle, as a tone wood, and that is a lovely wood. It's from, Northern California. And Southern Oregon. It's a pretty unique wood. I think it grows somewhere else in the world, but real unique to America and the Pacific Northwest. And it's sort of somewhere in between there. It's really similar to maple, but it has a few more bright characteristics and things like that. I don't use it enough to it's not that popular. It doesn't jump out. It's not incredibly the walnut is just so beautiful to look at that it's something that, people just would like, often want that, in a quality in the base because it's such pretty wood, so. Sitka spruce is where I started. It's really common around here. It's known as a tone wood in the guitar world, and people have been using it on bass for a while. Pacific Northwest, pretty big tree. It's got a very high strength to weight ratio. I think one of the strongest, highest strength to weight ratios for a spruce or a softwood at all. And it's how I started. I mean, I won some good tone awards with that wood, and it really is sort of. I come back to it quite a bit. It's really sort of your traditional bass, and you can make a really nice bass that, has the nice old Italian street feel with that. It's got sort of a nice cross between, it's got some bright stuff going on, but if you match it with walnut, it can be the darkest voice in the world, oddly enough. Like it and walnut put together sort of work together and just, they're talk about, chocolatey. That's some of the darkest bass I think I've ever built is a Sitka spruce and walnut combination. But if you put it on Western maple, it gets quite bright. It's almost reedy or horn-like qualities. The sort of the tuba punch. It's really interesting in that, like, if whatever your bow pressure, it starts speaking at a really, volume. It just goes right away, and it gets pretty loud, but it mostly, notably just starts speaking right away. It really, kind of, right, really is sort of a horn-like, poof, poof kind of quality. It's really neat. And, it also sort of, people are used to it. It's something that's not surprising, if you're not sure if you shouldn't be buying a, old bass or your teacher's bass or something, then, the Sitka spruce is something that, well, this has been done before. It's really good. We know it's going to sound good. And it's not so odd that it's not like, oh, you're getting, like, who's ever heard of a walnut bass? That's just strange. Also sort of in that category then is I'll use Engelmann spruce, which is, it grows at very high elevations in the West. So like 5,000 feet and stuff like that up in the cold. And it has a little lower density. It's a little bit lighter than the Sitka spruce. It's also real common. People use it all the time as tone wood. It's really nice and stable. It has a super nice mid-range fundamental note. I mean, it's sort of got that dark orchestral, I'm using your words here, warm, centered note. And folks really like that wood. And for orchestral playing, it's sort of got, nice voice, that sounds, chocolately and dark, but old early on. It sort of sounds like an older bass. Plenty of volume. Really, really, really nice. And there's where I'd sort of use that buttery kind of word. Although it also can, if you put spirocores on there, if we start mixing our sound qualities, it is a great jazz bass. That's what Chuck Israels has, a walnut and Engelmann spruce bass, and he really likes it. It's easy to play, although he uses the bow now, I guess, more than he used to because he likes doing that with it. But it sounds really good. It's just nice push, So you'll see these giant Sitka spruces down at the coast here, in Oregon. They're enormous. You get 4 or 5 people can't get their arms around them. It's not quite the scale of the giant redwoods, but they're really, really big trees. The Engelmann spruce tend not to get quite that huge, although we're using 40-inch diameter trees or something like that, to do it. A lot of this stuff is salvage, and it's all. I really also make a huge effort. I just want to say is to get wood where I know where it's coming from, that it's procured legally, because there is actually a fairly large black market in the Pacific Northwest of folks poaching large trees and cutting them down to billets and selling them for guitar or violin, or I suppose even bass wood. Although big money's in guitar, really. And you can't. It's really hard to track, and so that they're really working on that now. So I make a real point of trying to know my suppliers and know where they're getting their wood. And so then I'm going to move on to kind of the more fun, not more fun, but definitely different, more interesting to talk about. I have a big log, a pine log, Ponderosa Pine, specific species. Ponderosa Pine is all over the West, but in the Willamette Valley, it has its own little subspecies. So that's what this tree was. It was submerged under a mill pond for 50 years, which very likely affected how it dried. It cured it, with being completely soaked as opposed to, drying out in the air, it's sort of all the cells lost their cellular water underwater. And so I think because of that, it's very light wood and has great tonal qualities. But, pine itself, I'm sure, has good tonal qualities on its own. Has been used traditionally in Europe and stuff like that. Pine is very interesting. It's got a huge range of voice. You can start very, very, very quietly, and then it'll just kind of keep going. I mean, it's like until you run out and your string is just laid against the fingerboard. It wants to keep getting louder. It's just kind of neat. Yeah, it really pushes. But it isn't bright. It is more like cushiony was a word we haven't used yet. But I mean, it's just like sort of padded almost. And again, like it's hard to say padded without it feeling like it's quiet, but it isn't. It's just sort of, I've had some great experiences listening to just a single bass with, small orchestra and organ. And as soon as, the bass just took the floor of the whole space and was there, right down there, at the, right on the floor, like everything was above it. And it really felt like a big pillow for everybody to be on. And that translates into feel too. It's got a real padded left and right hand feel. It's easy to push on. It's and it's easy to pluck. It speaks really, really quickly, but it does not have that super bright punch. It's great for projection, but it just doesn't have like bright qualities. It doesn't have like tons of overtones at all. And if you match it with walnut, it gets a little bit brighter, maybe, but not really. It's sort of it's great to play, has great volume, but it doesn't have a whole lot of. It's like one punch. It's not in the fancy package. It's just a bass note. But it's real interesting though. And I have a lot of experience with that. That's a pretty popular wood. I don't know if bass taste might be changing just slightly, as I've only been making basses about 10 years, but I still think that when I first started, there was a real reach for that sort of like really padded, almost electronic bass note without any overtones and really, really dark but loud, And so that pine was just really fit the bill on that. I think people are looking for a little more brightness in a bass, a little more overtone, like kind of a little more complexity in the note now. I'm seeing people using spiral chords a lot more to get that sort of feel out of the bass they have. And I also see, like I had, I'll just jump ahead to, I've only made one bass out of cedar, which I had, and I think you had a chance to play it there at ISB. And I had spiral chords on it, and I put the spiral chords on because I had Chuck Israels down to check it out because he played it there and he wanted to make sure it was going to be okay for him. And so I had spiros on it, and then I shipped it, and I figured right away someone's going to be like, this bass, because the cedar, I think it was a cedar and walnut bass, and it had all kinds of overtones, like made it really loud too. It was quite loud and bright, kind of thing. And I figured, well, someone's going to make me put, some, Flexicore Deluxes or put some bel cantos on this thing. I never changed string the whole time. I kept offering, and people like, no, these are great strings. Don't mess with it. Got borrowed a couple of times to play. The bass sold. So I think people are liking a little more brightness. That said, the instrument I had in the competition which was Engelmann spruce and maple, also had enormous amount of interest, and a couple of people are ordering that because of that particular tone. So it really is what you're looking for. It's not that people are definitely going for one over the other. It's pretty interesting, and it's kind of a cool thing about the wood is, except that now we're all thoroughly confused because I haven't even talked about redwood yet. It's cool to be able to give people lots of options. Not just, the shape of the box or, how long the string is. And what I tell people is, play as many basses as you can. That was the neat thing about ISB was that there's so many basses there, and pay attention to what they're made of. And that'll, kind of give you a sense, perhaps, you have a tendency to always like a Sitka spruce bass, and then if you were thinking about having one built, then you'd know that would be a great route to go kind of thing. And if people are serious about buying a bass from me, it's almost always an order situation. And so I, send them, honestly, all over the country playing as many basses as they can, like, oh, I'm going to my friends for Thanksgiving. Where are you going? Oh, there's a bass pretty close to there. Try that one, and just try and get their gut reactions right away. Talk to them about it. So I think cedar might be brighter than spruce. It's got more overtone qualities than spruce, which I wasn't really expecting because redwood feels very similar to it. Carving it, and looking at it, they look real similar. But redwood sort of fits itself into a little kind of a niche almost in between them, the soft cushion sound of pine and the sort of real fundamental sound of Engelmann spruce, whereas the cedar just gets even brighter again than Sitka spruce and sort of, so it has more overtones, and it made it feel louder too. I think, having those overtones, like, especially in sort of the noisy ISB room situation, people could hear it right away. They're like, oh, this is bass. I can hear this, which is pretty interesting. Just a word, I'm using these non-traditional tone woods. The redwood and cedar are softer woods. And so if you're the type of person who is, prone to denting their bass a lot, and you know who you are, they're not for you. And all basses take a beating. I call them Humpty Dumpties, but those ones are more prone to dinging and danging, and also, you can't build a bass to survive everything. I do my best to make a bass that's going to survive all the climactic conditions that it's going to go through, especially presuming someone has, some good common sense when it comes to when the weather changes, and paying attention to that. But, you just can't build them to survive getting chucked down the stairs or loaded in the car and the bike, putting the bike on top of them or whatever, but some of them are more delicate, without a doubt, and the cedar topwood and the redwood topwood, I tell people straight up, like, you need to be more careful with this if you care about having dings and dents in your bass, They don't seem to be more prone to cracking or anything. I haven't had, unless people fall on them, they're not like, having any climate issues at all or anything like that. But, like your corners are going to get more abraded and things like that, which I think is worth paying attention to, that might not be the right thing for you. But if you know your environment and you don't really get out and set your bass down in the gravel very much, then it's no problem. My earliest basses are made out of redwood, and, every time the guy brings it in, I'm just like, your bass is in such great shape. I need to take a lesson from you. The tone in there, it's got some nice projecting qualities that sort of fall in between the pine and the Engelmann spruce. It's sort of got sort of that real easy play, padded, thick sound, but it also has, a little more brightness, especially if you match it with walnut. It becomes real pushy and can be a great jazz instrument. Pete Coco in New York bought one from me ordered one at the last ISB in Fort Collins, and he ordered it, with an extension to be his, full-on classical axe. And he's got he wasn't planning to use it for jazz, but he's done some great jazz recordings on it. It sounds good. So it's a real nice crossover there, I think, so yeah. Neat wood that's from the Pacific Northwest. It's got a story to start with. The redwood stash I have is, I only have a few more pieces, but, came from, they dammed the Columbia River, the big river that runs by Portland, in the 40s, and had to raise up a bridge that was going across that river, and then so they could put it across the reservoir. I think they raised it about 80 feet, and they built these big concrete forms underneath it. And to build the forms, they used these huge pieces of redwood, 2.5 inches by 11 inches wide, 20 feet long. And I think it was probably just regular piles of wood, but the carpenters, when they were doing that, when they found really, really nice ones, they set them off on the separate unit and just didn't ever use them. And then that unit sort of been floating around southern Washington and northern Oregon until I came across it around 2012 or something like that. And, the guy was real, like, what are you doing with it? And it's a funny story. He's like, I said, I was thinking about making a bass with this. And he's like, oh, really? Well, I'll just give you a piece. And I said, really? Cool. And he gave me a piece of this wood, and I made a bass with it. It's that, Sean Peterson here in Eugene plays it. And one of my earliest basses, I think. And I went back to the guy then, and I'm like, hey, man, do you have any more of that redwood, that really long stuff from the Bridge of the Gods when they raised that? And he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I'm like, no, it's really tight grain redwood. It's 2.25 by 10 inches. It's like 20 foot. They're up in the top, way up high. He's like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I'm like, man, you gave me a piece of this wood to make a bass out of. He's like, oh, did you make a bass? I'm like, yeah. He's like, show me some pictures. And I showed him some pictures on my phone. He's like, just, all right, come on out to the pile. He wasn't going to sell it to me for anything but that, basically. I don't know what you're talking about. And then, of course, it got real expensive. And really, the way to tell, like, if you're like really wanting to know, if like there's a bunch here in Oregon, there's a bunch sort of in the center of the country and in New York, and they're around. So and people are cool about it. So I mean, just try and find some different wood basins to play. It's pretty neat. The people who buy my instruments are often really excited to share too. So that there's definitely people who are just like are really just excited to show people what their bass sounds like, because it's pretty exciting.
Seth, thanks so much for chatting. So great to see you at ISB, and I think it's so exciting what you're doing. So congratulations. And folks, check him out online if you haven't, SethKimmel.com. You can look back at all these basses that he's made in these different types of woods. Great website, by the way, full of photos and great information. So thanks, Seth. Keep up the great work, and I'll be sure to be stopping by and checking out the shop the next time I'm in Eugene. Love Eugene. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I love chatting about these types of topics. If you ever want to listen to any of the luthier chats with Barry Colstein, with Chris Threlkeld-Wigan, Thomas Martin, you name it, they're all at contrabassconversations.com/luthiers. And by the way, you can do that for just about any topic, /auditioning, /jazz, /international, I think, or something like that. There are episodes that are based around that theme that you can find. And by the way, there's an index too to all this craziness. If you haven't checked it out, contrabassconversations.com/index is organized around topics, organized around where people teach, where they play, that kind of thing. I try to keep that updated. It's something that slips through the cracks for a couple months, and then I go back and update it. So I should probably go update that. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed today's conversation. Share this with a friend. Obviously, this is of interest to other string players and makers, not just bass players. So if there's anybody in your life that you think would benefit from hearing this, share it out. I'd appreciate it. I know Seth would appreciate it. And I'm so glad to have you along on this journey with me. I've got so much great content coming out in the next few weeks. These conversations keep coming. They're so fun for me, and I really hope you enjoy it also. So thanks for tuning in, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.